I think it's important that women in particular need to not see each other as competitors, but more of cheerleaders and support systems. Because of sexism and the patriarchy, we are pitted against each other.
Welcome to the Writing on My Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emanuela Stanislaus, doctorate coach and diversity consultant. I finished my doctorate in 4 years while working full-time, traveling the world, and balancing a busy social life, and now I'm on a mission to create community for other BIPOC women to complete their doctorate degrees. Join me as I discuss the ups and downs of pursuing a doctoral degree. I'll be sharing personal stories, and I'm bringing some friends along for revealing conversations about their doctoral journey and provide inspiration for others to level up as doc students. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Writing on My Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emanuela Stanislaus, and today we have a very special guest in the guest chair. We have Dr. Lynell S. Hodge today. She is a practitioner-scholar with decades of professional and research experience. Dr. Hodge currently serves as the Assistant Director of Occupancy Management for Housing and Residence Life at the University of Central Florida. Her expertise includes vicarious secondary trauma, social justice, and women's equity. She earned her doctorate from the University of Central Florida in higher education and policy studies, and her master's degree from the Florida State University in higher education. And she's also my friend because we actually were in that same program at Florida State University. We've been friends for over 15 years, and I am so excited to have her here. Welcome, Dr. Hodge.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here and, talk about your journey and hopefully inspire some folks during this whole, conversation. So,
Yeah.
why don't you tell everyone about your journey? What was the deciding factor in you pursuing your EDD?
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, we've been friends for a long time. And I remember when we met at orientation, I'm like, we're going to be friends forever. I just know it. But I'm a first generation immigrant to the US, the continental US, that is. And education has always been important to my family. And so I remember us sitting in the education building talking about our goals and how we were going to be either deans of students and VPs when we got older. And we were making these decisions about, well, what do we need to do in order to make those career moves? And it was a resounding, we have to get our doctorates. And so in 2004, 2005, we planted those seeds of pursuing educational advancement. What I didn't realize at the time is that professional experiences would take me kind of meandering in a variety of different experiences that put the goal of going back to school on hold for a little bit longer than I initially expected. But in 2012, I wanted to transition out of housing. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite happen that way. But I wanted to transition out of live in at a minimum. And I thought that it was going to be important for me, whatever my next career change in student affairs, student personnel, I would have to have my doctorate. So I was able to get into the program at UCF. I work at UCF. I got into the program and I started part time. And that's where it really started, or that's where it kind of was supported. And I finally was able to finish in 2016.
Awesome. You brought me back to 2003, us
Ah,
struggling as grad students in Tallahassee. And you know what?
ah,
I don't remember having that conversation about going to to get my doctorate. Like I thought I was like team I'm never getting my doctorate. At least that's what I
oh,
remember
no, no,
like
no. I
after.
remember. 'cause it was shortly after you got that I feel like you became the secretary of, the,
The house
per
sorry,
yeah,
higher ed
yeah,
student,
yeah, and we were like,
association.
"Okay." First of all, we were there out of our cohort, there were only a handful of us that were of color, really Black and Latinx, and so we were like, "Okay, guys, we have to, 1, finish, but 2, also make sure that we continue in the field, and what is that gonna look like?" I remember the maroon chairs, and we were like, "I don't know what I'm doing, we don't know what we're doing," but the next steps look like this. And I feel like you don't remember a lot of things from grad school because it was that stressful. But there are definitely nuggets of Krispy Kreme runs and what's the ice cream?
Oh, Cold Stone. I
A
was
Cold
obsessed.
Stone. Yeah, those late night Cold Stones. Like, I don't think I'm gonna make it. Yes, you're gonna make it. Let's go grab some ice cream and figure it out. But yeah, I remember it was late at night. I'm really remembering that we were exhausted, but we were making commitments to each other. It was me, you, and Rosemary. I don't know where Rod was at the time.
And y'all, we're talking about these were the 4,
Yeah,
Black Latinx, folks in our program of well, I think it was somewhere between 25 and 30 of us. We
yeah.
were a big class at that time. So, yeah, it was the 4 of us who we're all still friends now.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is awesome because I don't know if everyone still has that kind of central, like, we always find a way to come back to each other and check in. Now we have been able to like stay connected a little bit better than the other two, but I really think like if I did not accomplish anything else after grad school, the four of us really making sure that we graduated was a feat in itself and really I think is important to point out why it's important to have community, especially in these kind of stressful not kind of very stressful environments.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a highlight thing that we should also say is that 3 out of 4 of us have doctorate degrees now, which I think is, like, amazing, but
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, and community too is the reason behind the whole Writing on My Mind podcast and the extended community as well. I'm all about community, which I'm so glad that you mentioned. And you also mentioned stress, the stress of getting your master's degree and then also, going for your doctorate and working full time. And one of the things that, I mentioned in your bio is that your area of expertise is trauma. You research it, you've written scholarly articles about it, your dissertation was around that, and you also have your own coaching business where you provide emotion and stress coaching. And so, from your trauma expertise, how do you see trauma come into play with the doctoral journey for women of color?
Yeah, this is a big question, and we probably could spend hours talking through it. The one thing I'll say as a disclaimer is that as people of color, we continue to navigate stressful environments through survival and different coping strategies that have worked for us. So we have this complicated association with trauma and naming things as traumatic. And so, what I want to say is that if you're experiencing microaggressions, toxic work environments, sexual harassment, gaslighting, there's a variety of experiences that our communities tend to experience. That is trauma. It's very traumatic and it impacts the way you see yourself, the it impacts the way you see yourself being safe. And so that is what at the core what trauma does to cognition and psychological expression. And so for me, when I try to think about it in the environment of the academy, we have not seen the academy adjust with the changing demographics of students. It is very still Eurocentric in the way in teaching methods and not recognizing a variety of ways that people learn and can succeed. So while women of color, Black women, Asian women are enrolling in very high numbers and being and graduating, right? It's not always culturally responsive to the way that we learn or we express ourselves. And so the one thing that I think about is that culturally, like we share narratives, right? We communicate different. But in academia, it's a very structured way. One thing that I learned pretty quickly is that the perspective in terms of how we write and how we talk about bias as researchers, we separate, we try to say like the researcher found these things versus I. Now that could also be very like field specific, but that is very Eurocentric way of talking about research. So when you look at communities of color, it's a very collective way that we talk about what we learn and how we learn from each other. And so being separated from the way that we can express ourselves is very stressful, and we have to make these decisions about, well, what do I fight or what do I align myself with in order to succeed, and having to make those decisions on a continuous basis is very stressful. And sometimes the way the academy is set up is that you think that you're wrong when you're not, but you don't have the support to course correct, or because the institution values this very specific way, the only way that you can succeed is to conform. And what we learn over time is that it's replicated in the classroom, it's replicated in the research, and it's replicated in how we collaborate or even train new researchers. So as a practitioner, it's really important for me to make sure that I'm very concise with my language, but also making sure that I am learning and unlearning some of those Eurocentric ways of how I conduct research. So I'm honoring the group that I'm looking at, because people letting me into their experiences is very stressful in itself, but I want to be able to honor their experiences and make sure that it's not harmful. And so when I think about women going through the program and not having flex schedules in order to finish programs, or being the only one in your program or one of few, but these systems are set up where you can't really collaborate because you are now competing against each other. Those are all of the things that I think about, that even though we're graduating at really consistent and higher numbers, it is really at what cost?
That is so interesting. I loved everything that you shared with that. And so like for me, I'm wondering, I don't want to ask like how people can cope, because I don't know, I feel weird about that. I don't think that it's the job of the marginalized person to be doing things, but how do you think women of color can deal with the issue of the systemic racism that exists in these educational spaces?
Yeah, I think you're onto something in terms of where's the responsibility of fixing it. It almost always lands in the laps of women of color or the marginalized in most spaces. But their voices are always heard, or our voices aren't always heard. So it's kind of this um, dual consciousness of you want me to call it out when it happens, but then you don't want to do anything about it. So the one thing that I think what we really need to get back to as women, because we're socialized to be communal, is that we really need to reach out and find our spaces that we feel safe, and that our feelings of isolation, mistreatment can be validated, and then also help us to transition from that feeling of stress or anxiety about the space and come up with tools or mechanisms that you can navigate it, because the system won't always change, but the way you interact with it might be able to be a better strategy, right? And so I think it's important that women in particular need to not see each other as competitors, but more of cheerleaders and support systems. Because of sexism and the patriarchy, we are pitted against each other, and that's a disadvantage for us. And to keep the system in the way it's intended to work, which is we only let a few people in that don't look like us. And so women need to make sure that they are not leading into that, and not replicating harmful behavior of separation, isolation, gossiping, those types of things that typically would further disenfranchise us. So, in terms of coping, it's giving language to your experiences, because what we learn to do really well is hold it in. But that has a physiological impact on you, whether it's through anxiety, depression, anger, high blood pressure. All of those things are manifestations of not being able to give language to your experiences and holding them in. It also lends and gives breathing room to things like imposter syndrome or low self-esteem. Those are external things that you reaffirm through the way you see yourself. And so I know for me, I would not have gotten through grad school without my community in either setting, master's or doctorate. Now, my community was not in my program for my doctorate program, because I was working full time. I didn't feel like friendships or support was necessary, but my family filled in a gap that I'm not really sure if they realized how important it was, at the time, because they took things off the table for me. Like, I didn't have to worry about figuring out where I was going to eat. My mom was like cooking and washing clothes, and my sister would bring me coffee. So there were things that they rallied around me to make sure that I knew I was supported, and they gave me space. So when I had my meltdowns, I didn't feel like there was an option to stop. There was only an option to get it out, shake it off, say that it's normal, but how do we adjust and get back at it? And so I think how we cope needs to be done healthily, and it needs to also be sustainable.
Yeah, I totally agree with that for sure. Like one thing that came to mind though while you were talking was how do we know when things are normal? Like versus or are we normalizing things that are harmful to us? I don't know if those are two different questions, but it just made me think about that.
Yeah, I think we have to normalize toxic environments, because that is what white supremacy and racism is intended to do. If you are not a part of this entity, the group that makes the rules, but you want to participate, in some ways, you have to normalize the behavior. Racism is not normal. It is something that we have learned to navigate. Sexism is not normal, but it is something that we've learned to navigate. And I think what's interesting is that we always kind of glamorize or glorify women who are able to succeed. And I always say, but at what cost? At what cost was it that you had to be the only one or be the first one, and then maybe not having the space to be able to make room for more? Because oftentimes, and this as a social justice, and racism and racial, that it's an area of expertise for you, that we don't want people struggle with social justice because they feel like something is being taken away from them. And that's not true. you know, it's making sure that you are making space for all of the people that should and need to be there. And because we're so used to not having everyone participate in the conversation, it looks and might feel like in order to let everyone have a voice, that someone's voice will not be
Mm,
heard. It takes a little bit more time, right? But we know that it's better to have diverse opinions, diverse way of completing a task or living. There's no harm in shaking it up and doing something different. But I think you hit it on the head. We normalize these behaviors because it's not new. It's something that we've continued to have to experience. What has changed is the politeness of what is allowed and what is not, if that makes sense.
no, makes total sense. I appreciate you breaking that down. So, for you, how did you like what challenges did you experience as a Black woman pursuing your doctorate, and how did you persevere?
Yeah, so I really appreciate this question because as a Black woman, I was steered away from racialized topics as like, oh, you don't want to focus on diversity, right? Like, let that be someone else's experience. And, I think back on when I was thinking about what my topic would be. I needed it to be personal, and I didn't fight and then push back on what the topic was going to be. And so I think as a Black woman, I had to weigh my options on how many of us were actually getting through, because we had a lot of ABDs, which is all but the dissertation. And I didn't want to do that because, like, what was the point? I mean, the point is you made the decision and you put in the work, but the dissertation process is this black hole of of all of these unwritten rules that if you never gone through the process, it's intended to make you quit, right? And so I struggled with, well, who do I get to help? Am I a strong enough writer? How do I and the other thing too is that I was navigated away from doing qualitative research because I was getting an EDD, a practitioner's doctorate. It was communicated without like specific direct language that, well, you should definitely do a quantitative research to give your doctorate more value because it's not a PhD. So there were all of these rules that I had no idea that I needed to prep for or even consider. And literally, all I wanted to do was graduate. All I wanted to do was write, research, and get it done. And it just felt like now I had a fantastic chair who stretched me in a way that I think has now helped me. But the process was brutal, and I believe it was intended to shake and break people to maybe only have a few get through. The one thing that still sticks out for me when I think about my process is I overheard a conversation of faculty members, and one of them said, "Oh, well, we you got this chair because we knew you would graduate. We only give certain students to him because we know that they will succeed." And at the time, I took that as a vote of confidence, but really, as I reflect back, is you had to be self-guided, self-motivated, you had to have this immense level of self-endurance, because the opposite of that is that they did assign some students to him that they knew that wouldn't finish, right? So I wasn't special, and there was nothing that I did different other than I wanted to make sure that the time and energy that I spent in my program, I would be able to say I finished. Because having things not finished for me is plays into my anxiety. Like I need to get things off my to-do list. So my journey felt like a meandering kind of, you're the only person that you can count on, and you have to prove yourself at every corner, even when things are not at a corner. And fortunately for me, I was able to get through.
You gave a lot of nuggets in your answer just then. I think one of the things that you pointed to that will be helpful for other folks who are thinking about their doctorate or are currently pursuing it is that sometimes these programs have these built-in obstacle courses. You said they're intended to make you quit, which to me says a lot. When you're going into these spaces, you're thinking like, okay, it's going to be, a place that's going to help me to get to this goal. But then you experience these different obstacles that you have to jump through and navigate in order to get to what you really want to do. And, some of these things, like you said, it sounds like a setup, putting you with certain folks who may not be supportive, who may be pushing you out, giving you undue stress and putting undue obstacles in front of you for no reason. And so that's when you also talked about the how there's this built-in hierarchy in terms of PhD and EDD, and at the end of the day it's a doctorate, but there are these ways of looking at both of those degrees that are not affirming and how people have these different ways of viewing things that may impact you.
Yeah, I think and I want to be, cautious too about generalizing because my experience, is my responses to your questions are definitely rooted based on what my experience, but I've heard from enough friends to know that, there's some similarities in our story. So yeah, I definitely think because the degree in itself is supposed to be rigorous and prestigious, that not everyone can get it. And, we have these cyclical conversations about the value of education all the time when the data is very, very clear that, having a bachelor's degree, an associate's degree, any additional training outside of high school impacts your income over time, and it adds value over time. So it's always definitely strange to have these educational conversations about what is valuable and what's not, and to hear it replicated in a different way, such as a PhD means it was more rigorous versus an EDD, when literally the only difference for me in our program, the only difference was that you had to do a semester of teaching. Because the way our program's set up is that the EDD is traditionally a practitioner's doctorate, and the PhD, there's an indication that you will be teaching. So that was the only difference. And so, but when I'm in spaces and people hear that I do mixed method research, and I have an EDD, I am met with some questioning that, one, I'm a woman of color, I'm a Black woman with an advanced degree in a very quantitative focused area of research. And it creates this space of, do I defend myself or do I let the person just sit in their questioning? Because at this point, I don't need to defend myself. I did that in 2016 and I was confirmed, and I don't have anything else to prove. But it is definitely these unwritten hoops and barriers that if you aren't careful, you could either lean into it or your success might look different. Now, I also want to say that for people who aren't able to finish, your circumstances are, valid. And my hope is that no one feels that they're not good enough because they didn't get through because of those barriers. Grad school has no space for your outside life. And I don't know if you remember this, where faculty members would say, I don't really care what's going on outside of my classroom. I only care about my class. And that is super selfish and super unrealistic because students don't show up just in your classroom. That's not a holistic way of seeing people. And so I don't know, when people are going through divorces or pregnancies, I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Those types of, huge life circumstances impact the way you're able to navigate finishing your doctorate, and the academy does not allow for you to be able to navigate it because there's that clock that nobody talks about too, right? Like you have to finish in a certain time period. And if you don't finish, you have to start over. And who's going to start over at that point? So don't get me on my soapbox about these invisible barriers or these unwritten rules. And it's very specific to your institution and then granulated down to your program, down to your chair. And so if there's one thing that a listener can take away from this episode in particular, I just think being a part of a strong community that lets you express yourself, fully express yourself, and loves on you and helps you see through the fog of academia. I think, that would be the best thing that you could ever do for yourself.
Awesome. I also love the whole I defended back in 2016. I have nothing to prove. Yes. So I guess, the other thing too I'm thinking about is with that, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you started your program?
I wish I would have known that my mental health would have depreciated during the process. And that's a nervous laugh. That's not like a success laugh. That is something that I wish I would have been better prepared for just because I just felt most of the time I was writing, I was in a fog and I was battling trying to firm up what my topic would be, what research should be included, what didn't need it to be included, how do I make this unique enough and not lose myself in the direction that I was being steered. The other thing is the additional cost that my program required of me in order to defend my dissertation in itself. I needed to have a professional editor review my document. And I also had to pay for it to make sure that it wasn't plagiarized, which I think, is important. No one wants to be confirmed and then find out you plagiarized a manuscript. The one thing I think, another thing, not one thing, is that I had illustrations in my manuscript and I paid an illustrator or a graphic designer, excuse me, and who owns the rights of that images came up. And so I think there's some legalities of images and tables and things like that ends up in your document. But you don't learn those types of things until you have to start filling out paperwork, have it in your university library, or if you're getting a hard copy. So I think those are like the top things that I would have wished that I learned. The one piece of advice I would say is don't delete anything. Keep everything because it might be needed later. For instance, it could be needed for your defense, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in your document. And I think the other thing I wish I had known is the benefit of being organized, how helpful it could be to manage like illnesses and yes, I am saying that because I struggle with migraines, I would have a sense of when I would get a migraine. And so I would schedule, okay, I had a migraine for 4 days. So I lost these 4 days. How do I reschedule myself in order to make up for that time? So if you knew me while I was in the writing process, you knew I had my life scheduled down to a minute, every minute of every day. Now, I don't know in hindsight if that was helpful or it added to my decline in mental health, but in the moment, it was one way that I was able to maintain control. And I would say that it you need to build in rest because you're no good to anyone if you're not resting during that process.
Great advice, especially like hidden fees for your program that can come at you at times, like unexpected times, really. Legalities to staying organized, resting now. I think a lot of people are thinking about rest given like the popularity of the nap ministry. And, you talked about mental health and like the decline in your mental health. Can you talk a little bit about that and like maybe how you work through those moments?
Yeah, so in full transparency, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety during my program, during that time period. So I don't know if the program or the experience exasperated the anxiety that I was already experiencing. But for me, when I am feeling anxious and it's not, you know, tied to something, how it manifests is in organization. So I have a list for everything. And I think I shared with you when you started writing how I would have my week separated in terms of how many things that I needed to write or read in order to get to a certain word count. And I would just move things around in order to make sure that I was being productive. And so that's one way I navigated my anxiety. The other thing is that I'm an avid romance reader. And when you're a trauma researcher, I didn't know this then, right? But now I know. For me, having like a disconnect from the research and kind of it's almost like a palate cleanse for me to reset my brain. Like everything isn't doom and gloom. Human beings and the human experience is not always awful. So reading romance for me was like a way to like switch my thinking. Because the one thing eventually I learned through my dissertation when I was doing the research is that traumatic information can be transmitted through documents, so reading. And I was literally looking at sexual assault numbers in housing staff, responding to sexual assaults for live-in housing staff, the duty, responsibility, suicide rates. So I was in very heavy information for hours at a time. And I, worked about 50 hours for work. And then I turned around and gave another 50 hours to my dissertation. And so having that disconnect for me was really important. And I go back to my family because again, as a first generation, I was the first person in my family, in my nuclear family, to get my master's, and then followed my sister got hers a year later, and then I was the first and only person in my family to get my doctorate. And now I have two aunts that have their doctorate, but for my nuclear family, they didn't really know how to support me. But being a Caribbean, my is very involved in my life. And my mom, she hurt when she saw me struggling. And so I think not wanting to see my mom sad about me struggling, because, she was like, we have to finish, right? It's not Lynell has to finish, but we have to finish. And so just spending time with her, and my mom's love language is acts of service. So she would just like dote on me, and I would hear her talking about me with her friends about how hard I'm working and how proud of. Now she might not be saying this to me per se, but she's saying it to like family and friends, and she's telling people not to call me and give me the breathing room that I needed. But between her and my sister and my younger brother, I mean, they were just like loving on me when I was like, this is not going to work out. And so, and even my dad, he's a man of few words, but he would fix something or tinker with something that would be would take away from my attention, like my car or something, and he would just fix it without me even saying that I needed it. So my family really came in and saved the day because they were trying to fill holes that I didn't even realize that were there. Sometimes because I was so hyper focused on, do I need brain scans in my dissertation versus sexual assault numbers and response rates? And so I did not always do a good job of managing my anxiety. And I want to be clear on that. It's still a learning lesson for me. But what I did learn through that process is that sometimes you have to say it. Like I'm having a moment and I need help. And so I did learn that during that process, even though I didn't always do a good job managing it.
No, I appreciate your vulnerability with that. I'm sure, some of our listeners could, appreciate some of the things that you shared and I do like that it came back to your support system too, right? And being there at times when you needed and even at times when you weren't able to communicate the need that you needed. So, all right. So now we're going to go ahead and transition to the lightning round questions. Are you ready?
Yeah, bring it on.
So this is when, I ask a question as it relates to your doctoral journey and you share, kind of quick things that come to mind in answering those questions. So let's jump right into it. So, why don't you share with us your favorite mantra as it relates to your doctorate journey?
So, two things, which I haven't shared yet. Church and therapy were really good support systems as well. And so, my mantra that I not kind of, through Bible study, I was reminded of Psalm 27:17, which is iron sharpens iron as a friend sharpens a friend. And depending on your translation, because sometimes it says man, sometimes it says person, sometimes it says entity, but I prefer the version where it says friend. And so for me, the more that I showed up, it felt like I was being sharpened and I was being a better friend, better researcher, better student, better sister, better daughter. Now, that also meant that I had to be open to feedback. But during that process, I was like, how am I checking to make sure that I'm showing up and being present when I'm in spaces with my loved ones?
Awesome. I love it. What's one thing that you couldn't live without?
Um, Sticky notes, which is still very much true. If you want to tell me you're thinking about me, yeah, you give me sticky notes and I will gush and pine like you gave me $1,000,000.
And I can attest to that, because you got super excited about buying some sticky notes the other day. I was like, "Okay."
Yeah.
And but I have love for sticky notes too, so there's no judgment here. Okay, next, what's your favorite hype song?
Oh, I'm so embarrassed to say this, but it's Monster from Meek Mill. I don't know, and it's totally probably not PC, but something about that song just amps me up and provides some clarity. Yeah.
So Meek Mill providing clarity, love it, okay.
Yeah, I don't know why. He also there's also when I'm doing, and it really is dependent on the group, of course. I start my presentations with he has a song called Trauma, and it really crystallizes what it means to be a Black man living in public housing and how police surveillance and how gangs and drug dealers exploit low income kids. And now I'm not saying that Meek Mill is a poet or a prolific writer, because there's some complicated things about the way he navigates life and a little bit of misogyny. But there are some nuggets in terms of of the music. So Meek Mill is, yeah, my complicated dirty secret.
That works for me. Let's see, so what was your go-to practice to celebrate your wins?
Uh, yeah, it would probably be, gorging myself on M&Ms, um, which I don't do anymore because it's not good for my internal system, but yeah, it would be cracking open a family size pack of M&Ms and going in. Now, I have a glass of wine. My palate has, adjusted a little bit, but I also think I want to be transparent that I don't know if I do a good job of celebrating wins or accomplishments. I think I've been socialized to keep my head down and crank things out that I want to say maybe not until recently where I've slowed down and actually paid attention, like, oh, yeah, you just published 4 articles in 1 year, or, we're working on a book chapter right now, or, yeah. So I'm still working to get better at that, about that.
No, that's a good point, and I wanna normalize celebrating our wins, and, some things are like, "Oh, yeah, whatever, we downplay whatever we're doing, and no, it's like, let's stop for a little bit, let's acknowledge, the energy that you put towards this goal, and let's celebrate it. So, yes, I'm gonna try and help you to celebrate more for sure.
Yeah, I definitely think I'm better at celebrating other people's wins, um, more so than I am with my own. So I definitely think that is something that overall we could probably work on. But the other thing too is that for me, I focus more on the things that maybe I don't do well, because it's for me, the non-win is a good learning opportunity, and I want to make sure that I don't get hung up on certain things. So if you had asked me the inverse of that question, I would probably give you a good a better response.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We put a lot of more energy on the constructive piece.
Mhm.
But yeah, oh my gosh, this has been so great. I appreciate you coming on the show today. You shared a lot that I know is going to be very helpful to all of the women out there who are, either thinking or pursuing their doctorate degrees. And so I want to make sure that people know how to connect with you, how to follow you, and, how to take advantage of the coaching opportunities that you have for them. So do you mind sharing that?
Sure, yeah, I would love to. My Twitter and Instagram handles are at Lynell S. Hodge. And then if you want to engage with and be familiar with my work, my website is lynellshodge.org. I'm currently working on some resource tools or resources to be uploaded on the website for free download, because I really want to make sure that there are more access points for communities of color, women of color, to talk about trauma and what that looks like. So 2021, I'll be working on that. But if you want to reach out to me and kind of pick my brain and kind of see what help or resources that I can provide, my email address is also linnellshodge@gmail.com.
Great. Thank you so much, friend, for being a guest on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I really want to pause and say this initiative, I know you talked about it, and I just love that you put the time and energy into creating this space and doing the work to put it out into the universe. And my hope is that women recognize how important this space that you're trying to create is going to be beneficial for them. If even if the content doesn't connect with them right away, just having a community available, especially in times of COVID, how we're having to isolate, creating this online community is going to be so helpful and beneficial to folks who like us did not have these kind of communities available to us.
Aw, I really appreciate it. Thanks again.
No problem.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Writing on My Mind podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, make sure you subscribe and rate the show on Apple Podcasts and spread the word to other women of color doctoral students to grow our community. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Dr. Emanuela. And if you're looking for a group of real women of color doctoral students to help you accomplish your goals, join the Writing on My Mind community by visiting writingonmymindpodcast.com. See you on the next episode.